Okay, so I'm going to try and skip over most of the rhetoric that goes along with debates about Israel and Palestine, and hopefully talk about something that I think, at least outside Israel, doesn't really get any kind of discussion. I think it's one of the aspects that is quite easily overlooked when people talk about possible solutions or roadblocks, what's preventing a peace. So hopefully it'll be, I guess, something a little bit new, a little bit fresh, and something that hopefully won't be quite so polarizing. So essentially what I want to talk about is Israeli politics and the way the political system in Israel works and how this affects the Israel-Palestine conflict in general, and I think in a very long-winded way I'll eventually get back to the current operation in Gaza. So first of all, the political process in Israel is done through direct proportional representation, which is a little bit different from how the political system in, say, Britain or the United States works. I think Australia, I know New Zealand does, they have direct proportional representation. So if you're Australian or you're Kiwi, you'll probably have some idea of what I'm talking about. But what it essentially means is that there is an Israeli parliament. It has 120 seats. And the way these seats are distributed are according to what proportion of the vote you get. So if you do the math, anyone who gets not even 2%, like 1.5% of the vote, gets a seat in the parliament, which is called the Knesset, Knesset, the Israeli Knesset. So what this essentially means is you have a very factionalized Knesset. Traditionally in Israel, as in a lot of countries, there are two mainstream parties, one left, one right wing. The right wing being the Likud party, and the left wing being the Labour Party. But the number of seats these two parties get in every election is pretty small. It's usually between 30 or 40 seats out of 120. So what this essentially means, all the rest of the seats are made up by these very small, very narrow interest political parties. A good example being GIL, G-I-L, GIL, who are the Israeli Pensioners Party. They currently have, I think, maybe 11 or 12 seats in the Knesset, which is actually about the same as Likud got in the last election. And yeah, they're a pensioners party, so they don't have any kind of national platform. They don't have any kind of policy towards the Israel-Palestine conflict or peace or negotiations or anything like that. They're essentially just involved with pensions and healthcare. That's all their interest is. And so what happens is when a big political party like Likud or Labour come into power, they have to form a coalition with these smaller groups in order to get anything through Parliament. If they want to succeed, they have to form coalitions with these much smaller groups. So a lot of these very small, narrow interest parties get a lot more political power than they otherwise would. I think a very good example is Yisrael Beitenu, who are a very right-wing political party. They're headed by a guy called Victor Lieberman. And at various times he's called for bombing the Aswan Dam to drown Egyptians. He's called for drowning Palestinian pensioners. He went as far as to actually offer buses to take them there to drown them. He's very, very right-wing. And his party was, until fairly recently, a part of the leading coalition. So essentially these very small, narrow, and in sometimes very extreme groups are able to bribe the government into getting what they want in order to join the coalition. So again, going back to Yisrael Beitenu, they recently left the coalition because they are opposed to any kind of talks with the Palestinians. They completely oppose it. So they left. They threatened for a long time, and then they finally left the coalition, which makes the current leadership, the current leading coalition, very, very weak. So, yeah, essentially you have these small, very narrow interest parties able to bribe the bigger parties into what they want. And I think this is one thing people tend not to look at when we talk about the peace process, is the effect these small groups have on the parties. Like you look at the Labour government during the Camp David negotiations with Barak, and essentially the same thing happened. A lot of these small groups left the coalition because they were opposed to the peace negotiations, and then Barak lost all his political power and was very, very close to being impeached by the end of his ministership. So, like a few people have mentioned, I think even if the leadership does want peace, does want to make progress in the Israel-Palestine conflict, they are often prevented by this situation. As for a solution, I'm not really sure. I mean, without having to completely restructure the political makeup of Israel, I mean, I'm not sure how you would do it. I'm not a political theorist, so I don't know what alternatives there could be, but I think it's something that's worth talking about. So anyway, this leads me to what I really wanted to talk about with regards to the operation in Gaza right now. And I personally think one of the main reasons why this operation went ahead, and the timing of it and so forth, is a lot to do with internal Israeli politics. And essentially the situation you have now is that Kadima, who are the ruling party, are very, very weak. And a lot of polls right now indicate that if the elections had happened right now, Likud, who are the right-wing party, would come to power, that Kadima would lose the next elections. So I think a lot of this is to do with trying to get right-wing support, trying to appeal to the more hawkish ministers and population and so forth. But for Kadima, there is much more at stake than just simply the next elections. As I said earlier, there have been traditionally two main parties in Israel, Likud the right wing, Labour left wing. This was until 2005 when Ariel Sharon, who was always traditionally a member of Likud, proposed his Gaza withdrawal plan, and it was opposed by the Likud. So he withdrew from that party, and quite surprisingly and very suddenly he formed his own new party called Kadima. And a lot of it was made up from former Likud ministers, some Labour ministers as well. So it's still kind of a right-wing party, but it's more left-wing than Likud. And they won the elections in 2005 by an absolute landslide. So Ariel Sharon became prime minister, Kadima became the ruling party. And the problem you have now is that Ehud Olmert has been the prime minister for the last 2 years. Ariel Sharon fell into a coma around 2006, and he was replaced by Ehud Olmert. And prior to Ariel Sharon collapsing, no one really knew who he was. He's a very weak leader. People didn't really know much about him. So ever since then, Kadima has had quite a political crisis. Essentially, Ariel Sharon was one of the key figures holding the whole thing together. It's really raised the question of whether Kadima can survive as a political party. And again, with the suggestion that Likud will in fact win the next elections, is very, very serious for Kadima. They have no strong leader, as in Ariel Sharon. Zipi Livni is the current candidate. Ehud Olmert will likely be convicted, possibly jailed on corruption charges. So they're in a very, very bad state. And if they lose this election, then I think we could well see Kadima collapse. I think if Likud win the elections, I think it really does raise the question of what is the point of Kadima as a political entity. So I think there's more at stake than just simply the next elections. It's Kadima as a party. So I think this is something obviously very serious for them, and I think has played a very large part in the decision to wage this campaign, and also the timing of it. I guess we'll see. The elections are in the middle of February, and I think it's just something I haven't really seen talked about outside of Israeli press. So hopefully it might give some new perspectives and some new insight to the conflict. And I hope this has been useful, and I'll be interested in hearing anyone else's thoughts on the topic.